Hey everyone, I'm John Lawless from Fannie Mae. I have one of the best and worst jobs in the world, which is to work on housing issues and try to address affordable housing. I wanted to talk about a couple of the trends that we're seeing right now that I think everyone's focused on, given sort of the dual crises we face as a country. First and foremost, the COVID pandemic and sort of its implications on every aspect of life. But the one that really relates to housing is how will it impact where we choose to live, where we choose to work. Obviously, nobody knows the answers to those questions, and almost anything could happen as a result of it. But without a doubt, it's put a lot of questions on, are we at the point where remote working is going to take over? In which case, you might see this sort of exodus from the city. And frankly, a lot of the office buildings that are sitting in cities end up being unused. And office buildings built post-1960 typically don't have windows that can open, so it's really hard to reimagine them as being residential hubs. And frankly, even if they could be converted to residential, who would live there if the cities don't offer the same sort of vibrancy that they offer today? So, part of the question for us in housing, particularly in affordable housing, is the cities have really been not great for a long time because so many people want to live in them. Home prices have gone up tremendously. And so that's pushed a lot of people who are lower income outside of the city or to have to make significant trade-offs in housing. But if people are going to start moving from the city, how do we facilitate that wealth movement so that it benefits surrounding areas, but also doesn't create what we saw in the sort of 60s, 70s, and 80s of the sort of white flight from the city, where you create massive inequalities because you have these really rich clusters of suburbs with big homes, and then cities that no longer have the income or the tax income to maintain themselves. So a lot of interesting policy questions there. Again, not knowing what's going to happen, it's hard to really do anything about it yet, but I do think thinking through how we might use space differently, how we might rethink suburbs, right? I mean, suburbs, when my parents moved to the suburbs, were these sort of long streets, idyllic, and you get in your car and drive to work. That's not going to be the suburb of the future. You want the suburb to feel like a city. You want to be able to walk to a local hipster bar and get a pint of a craft beer or something, right? But you certainly can't do that in the sort of suburbs that our grandparents live in today. But is there a way to transform the way that the housing exists there into a way that will better accommodate that move? The other crisis that our country is facing right now is obviously one that stems from centuries of inequality in this country, and particularly sort of inequalities in terms of race and sort of racism, the history of frankly segregation, and a lot of bad policies in housing that have caused a lot of segregation. This is a really, really challenging issue. You think about the process of buying a home. If you want to buy a home to gain access to wealth, or sort of that sort of forced saving mechanism, you've got to have good credit. Well, frankly, to have good credit in this country really helps to have wealth, but to have wealth, you need a home. And so there's this kind of cycle that's only become worse in the past few decades, which is sort of making housing a thing that rich white couples do, and everybody else is really failing to be able to access that wealth, which is just going to keep pushing us in that sort of unequal direction. Actually, the home ownership gap between Black and white Americans has hit a 50-year high. And that's incredibly depressing. And the other stat that's really, really sad is that when Black Americans own homes, they're much less likely to gain wealth because they're often residentially segregated into areas that don't appreciate as much. And so unlike their white counterparts who live in neighborhoods who gain value, they're not gaining that value and that benefit of homeownership. So what do we do about this? I mean, in terms of access, a lot of people turn to education. How do we get the word out about building strong credit? How do we think creatively about underwriting credit? I mean, credit scoring is not the perfect way to assess risk. It's good. I mean, it certainly does separate out borrowers that end up in default versus not. But it misses a lot of the true depth of information that you would get from actually knowing a human being, right? And so can we rethink credit? One that I really love is sort of this idea of sharing equity in homes. So, today we think about you rent, meaning somebody else owns the home and you rent it, or you own the home outright. And so one of the things I've thought about is, in order to better eliminate segregation and bring people into different neighborhoods, is can you have multiple people buy one house even though it's more expensive, or have investors share the ownership of that one house to enable that to be more cost effective for folks. Look, I could go on and on. I will say that these problems are really, really challenging, but what we really need is a lot of bright people focused on them to fix it, because housing really sits at the heart of a lot of these issues and challenges that we face as a country.